Will tariffs really wreck your savings or just raise prices 1 to 2%? Hello, members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. Markets, both bonds and stocks, have been in a state of meltdown since President Trump announced the latest round of tariffs on April 2nd, as we've all seen. But despite all the news, there still seems to be a fair bit of tariff confusion. So with that in mind, here are the 5 topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. What tariffs did President Trump announce this past week? 2. What are President Trump's goals with his tariffs? 3. What are the risks of the new tariffs? Here we'll be sharing with you an analysis from the San Francisco Fed that shows how much of what we buy is actually imported and by definition tariffed. 4. What are the 3 ways this might play out, including my personal take on the situation? And 5. What's everyone doing with their money right now? As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. What tariffs did President Trump announce this past week? 2 rounds of tariffs were announced on April 2nd. Round 1 went into effect on April 5th, 2025 at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. President Trump imposed a 10% tariff on all countries, using his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. Round 2 is expected to go into effect on April 9th, 2025 at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. President Trump will impose an individualized reciprocal higher tariff on the countries with which the United States has the largest trade deficits. All other countries will continue to be subject to the original 10% tariff baseline. And here's an overview from Eagle Eye of what the announced Trump tariffs mean by country. The highest rates will be levied on countries that the U.S. has, in relative terms, the highest trade deficits with. Smaller, relatively underdeveloped countries that just don't buy that much from the U.S. dominate this group, led by Cambodia, Laos, Madagascar, and Vietnam, all with tariffs between 46% and 49%. Among our largest trade partners in absolute terms, China is in for a 34% tariff, Japan for 24%, and the EU with a somewhat more moderate 20%. Some smaller developed nations have surprisingly high tariffs as well. For example, Switzerland, which is an exporter of many high-end products. Switzerland will be tariffed 31%, and Taiwan, which is famous for its electronics and chip industries, will be tariffed at 32%. The group with the 10% base rate is relatively long, and besides Britain, Australia, and Singapore, contains many Latin American countries such as Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. However, there are 2 large exceptions from the new tariffs. Firstly, there are 2 important countries that are generally exempt from the latest announcement. Canada and Mexico are unaffected by this order. This means USMCA compliant goods will continue to see a 0% tariff, essentially allowing the tariff-free trade under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, or USMCA, the former NAFTA, to continue. This reflects the agreement that Trump struck with Canada and Mexico after he targeted these 2 countries first with his first surprise tariff announcement in early February. However, goods outside the USMCA, non-USMCA compliant goods, will see a 25% tariff in most cases. And as a second exception, some types of goods will be exempt from the new tariffs, regardless of their countries of origin. This includes steel or aluminum articles and autos or auto parts, in addition to copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and lumber articles, as well as bullion and energy and other certain minerals that are not available in the United States. This doesn't mean that these imports will all be free from tariffs, though, as they still might be subject to their own special schedules. And yes, it's getting more and more complicated in tariff land. So there's a lot to digest from Trump's announcement, both for the markets, the companies affected, and retail investors and consumers like us here in this community, which leads us to the next big question for today's video. What are President Trump's goals with his tariffs? From our perspective, it seems that President Trump is trying to achieve three primary goals with his new tariffs. First and foremost, he wants to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and reverse the decline in our domestic manufacturing base. As the White House fact sheet says, in 2023, U.S. manufacturing output as a share of global manufacturing output was 17.4%, down from 28.4% in 2001, about a 40% decline in relative terms. And it continues. The need to maintain a resilient domestic manufacturing capacity is particularly acute in advanced sectors like autos, shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals, transport equipment, technology products, machine tools, and basic and fabricated metals, where loss of capacity could permanently weaken U.S. competitiveness. Bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. should not only create better-paying American jobs, making beautiful American-made cars, appliances, and other goods, but also strengthen our national defense capacity and make our national supply chain more robust. Moving on now to Trump's second goal. He wants to level the economic playing field, so to speak, and help American exporters by attacking both monetary tariffs and non-monetary trade barriers imposed by other countries. As an example for the unfair treatment of American exporters, he cites the Japanese and Korean automotive markets, where trade barriers other than tariffs, including non-acceptance of certain U.S. standards, duplicative testing and certification requirements, and transparency issues, mean that the U.S. automotive industry loses out on an additional $13.5 billion in annual exports to Japan and access to a larger import market share in Korea, all while the U.S. trade deficit with Korea more than tripled from 2019 to 2024. And Trump's third goal. He wants to collect significant revenue for the federal government from what he calls the new External Revenue Service. According to this report to the president, one day after the tariff announcements, the creation of an External Revenue Service, ERS, offers an opportunity to improve tariff collection. So, as many of our Diamond NestEgg regulars already know, our country runs persistent budget deficits, and with the proposed Trump tax cuts on top, this extra revenue from tariffs could almost certainly help to some degree. MarketWatch even reports that the Senate budget resolution is counting on $2 trillion in tariff revenue already. So, Trump's three goals for imposing higher tariffs: more manufacturing jobs in the U.S., better access to foreign markets for American exporters, and higher federal revenues. These really should not come as a surprise. He's been speaking about them consistently since his campaign days. So in a way, he's merely fulfilling some promises that he's made to get elected. What does come as a surprise, though, is that at least the first two of Trump's goals for imposing the new tariffs are getting some support on the other side of the political aisle as well. Maybe not for the way they're being introduced, but at a minimum, there seems to be some sympathy in principle on the liberal side of the political spectrum for using tariffs to help bring well-paying manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. As the New York Times wrote in a newsletter the day after Trump made his announcement, there are plenty of good arguments for how the neoliberal economic world order of the past 40 years or so has dealt a rough hand to so many working-class Americans. Even free trade economists would acknowledge the potential benefits of some kind of tariff policy, maybe focused directly on China. And in a separate article published by the New York Times on April 2nd, the author acknowledges that in some cases, there's truth to the president's claim that the United States offers its trading partners more favorable terms than it often gets in return. As a proponent of free markets, the United States has long been more open to trade than many countries globally. So, with such support from even unexpected sides for the imposition of new tariffs, let's move on now to the next section of today's video. What are the risks of the new tariffs? So, as my Chinese grandfather and Marcus's Austrian grandmother both used to say, and no, they didn't know one another, everything in life comes at a price, Or as we say in America, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And this is true for tariffs as well. Even if they achieve some of their stated goals, what might be the key risks and downsides? Well, first, tariffs may make imported goods more expensive, creating inflationary pressure. This is probably the single most quoted concern that observers have when they discuss Trump's new tariffs, including Fed Governor Powell, who in this economic outlook from Friday stated that while uncertainty remains elevated, it is now becoming clear that the tariff increases will be significantly larger than expected. The same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. The size and duration of these effects remain uncertain. While tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation, it is also possible that the effects could be more persistent. Now, some analysts seem to think that the fear of inflation may be overblown in this context, and the underlying reason for this conclusion is that even for goods prominently labeled as made in China or made in Vietnam, it's often only a small part of the price the consumer pays that actually ends up in these countries. The San Francisco Fed published a study in early 2019 with an example that in principle should still be valid today. When you buy a $100 pair of Nike sneakers made in Asia, only $25 of its cost goes to the Asian factory that assembles the shoes. Of the remaining $75, $3.50 is spent on shipping from Asia to the United States, and $21.50 goes to Nike to cover its design, marketing, profits, and other expenses. The remaining $50 goes to the U.S. retailer. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The U.S. firms who allow their products to be assembled in Asia or any other low-cost location do so exactly because labor is very cheap there in order to minimize what they have to pay to this foreign country. And the relative share of the sales price that goes to the manufacturing country can be even smaller for more expensive items like iPhones and laptops, where most of the value lies in the software and design of the computer chips, all of which are usually developed in the U.S. Overall, the San Francisco Fed found in their study that the import share of U.S. personal consumer expenses only amounts to 10%, meaning that of every $100 you spend as a consumer for your personal needs, only a little bit more than $10, or roughly 10%, will actually end up in another country to pay for non-U.S. input. And this bar chart shows where the money ends up. Nearly a quarter of these expenditures are on goods and services made in China, while another quarter is made in the Euro area and Mexico combined. Knowing that this oversimplifies things quite a bit, but just to show an initial yardstick, this might mean that on a purely mathematical basis, a 10% or 20% tariff on 10% foreign content might increase the overall prices paid by consumers by 1 to 2%. Clearly not great, but also probably not the end of the world either. That said, there is also a potentially much more consequential second risk from the new tariffs, one that could really wreak havoc with our economy. Tariffs could lead to a severe disruption or even a potential breakdown of global trade and the international economic order. And maybe this fear explains the severe market sell-off that we saw these past 2 days. In any case, that's what happened with the Tariff Act of 1930, more commonly known as the Smoot-Hawley Act, after its two main sponsors. It was meant to strengthen domestic industry by shielding U.S. companies from foreign competition at the onset of a recession that had begun in the second half of 1929 and was later to evolve into the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Smoot-Hawley Act raised tariffs sharply. The average rates on dutiable imports subject to the new tariffs, reached almost 60% in the early 1930s. Now, the average rate for all imports never went that high and peaked at about 20%, after taking into account all the exceptions that Smoot-Hawley contained as well. Economists and historians are still discussing today how much of the Great Depression was actually caused by the new tariffs and the retaliatory measures that most other countries took, versus other factors such as the parallel stock market weakness and banking crisis, or the lingering conflicts and political instability in both Europe and Eastern Asia. But there is a broad consensus that Smoot-Hawley didn't help. And indeed, as you can see from this chart, tariff rates were brought back down from their peaks again relatively fast with the Trade Agreement Act of 1934 and have overall followed a downward path ever since that time, until this year. Drop a comment below if you want us to have a closer look at what Smoot-Hawley actually did and how it all played out over time during the Great Depression in a separate video. For today, let's keep going with the third and final risk, that new tariffs will not help our international relations. While we may be able to live with the fact that some countries, such as China, that are increasingly seen by many as more adversarial than friendly anyway, that China might not like the new rates, will new tariffs help us in the long run, or are we running the risk of losing our closest allies in Europe and Asia? In times of heightened international competition and even aggression by some countries that are often outright hostile to the US, we might want to keep our friends close and well aligned. Now, after these sobering thoughts that we might pay for the potential benefits from the new tariffs with higher prices, the disruption of the global economic order, and less support from our allies and friends on the international stage, let's have a look at how this all might play out over the coming days, weeks, and possibly months, which is a great segue into the next section of today's video. What are the 3 ways this might play out? There are many ways this could play out, but tariffs are complex enough. So let's keep this simple and talk about the 3 primary scenarios I have in my head. The best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and the we personally think this is likely scenario. And let's start with the best case scenario first, because, well, no one talks about it, and you'll see why in a moment. Even Marcus and the kids laughed out loud when I laid this one out for them. The best case scenario is that every country accepts President Trump's reciprocal tariffs, and the world keeps moving along. So these countries would say, President Trump, you're right. We tariffed your imports unequally for a long time. We accept these reciprocal tariffs. You see why no one talks about the scenario. It'll never happen. Now, let's move to the worst case scenario, the one that the media, the markets, and quite a few of you here have talked about often. There will be a full-blown trade war across nations, leading us into the next global depression. And let's dive a bit deeper into this one. President Trump is well known for using the initial threat of high tariffs as a bargaining chip to strike a good deal. And many indications speak for the assumption that it's not different this time. In fact, that's exactly how it played out back in February when he first announced surprise tariffs for Canada and Mexico, but then entered negotiations with these 2 countries that ended up with a compromise that both sides can more or less live with. As we discussed at the beginning of this video, Canada and Mexico are not affected by the new tariffs, but continue to trade with the U.S. based on the USMCA free trade agreement that pretty much completely exempts a good part of their exports from any tariffs, at least for the time being. Yes, Canada is talking loudly about reciprocal tariffs on items that are not part of the USMCA, but perhaps they should be spending more time trying to make those Canadian goods USMCA compliant rather than focusing on reciprocal tariffs. But that's just one girl's opinion. Please take it for what it's worth. So, the provisions in the White House fact sheet contain deadlines that seem to have a similar sequence of negotiation in mind. The higher country-specific tariffs will only go into effect next Wednesday, April 9th, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video. This timeline seems to be designed to give the governments involved a few days to strike a deal in the kind of high-pressure, tight timeline setting that the president seems to relish. Now, even if we get to some successful tariff and trade agreements this way, this may still leave us with a 10% base rate on many of our imports. Personally, I don't get the feeling that Trump will want to completely retreat from higher tariffs after all he said about the issue. He does appear to have a strong conviction for tariffs, but still, 10% is better than 49% or even 20%, and might be much less disruptive to the global economy. Many of our trade partners seem to have expected something along these lines, and while voicing their displeasure, have so far refrained from actually imposing retaliatory tariffs, while presumably starting negotiations behind the scenes to get to a workable agreement with the Trump administration. That said, and as far as we're aware at the time of this taping, China was the only exception among major economies. They put a few of their own bargaining chips on the table, so to speak, by announcing that China will match Trump's proposed rates with a retaliatory tariff of their own on all imports from the U.S. starting next Thursday, exactly one day after the Trump tariffs are scheduled to go into effect. As the Wall Street Journal explains, China's decision to apply 34% levies on all imported goods from the U.S. next Thursday, after President Trump's tariffs go into effect, rattled markets in part because it further deflated hopes on Wall Street that a global settlement could be reached soon. So, presumably in an effort to calm markets a bit, President Trump went public on Friday to reiterate that he is open to tariff negotiations, as CNBC reports, and he didn't shy away from contradicting White House aides to make sure his invitation to negotiate came across clearly. Which brings us to the we personally think this is likely scenario. Negotiations will happen. I feel pretty confident about that, and I hope I'm not wrong about this one. And the initial reciprocal tariffs may come down for countries who are willing to engage constructively, as has happened so far in the cases of Mexico and Canada, more or less. And while the process may be prolonged, it may hopefully not lead to an all-out trade war. Let's face it, we are a global economy. And as those of you who subscribe to Your Financial Journey may have seen from Caitlin and Ava's video on the top 100 most valuable companies in the world by market cap, they are predominantly American, regardless of whether the market is going through a rough few days or not. The world uses iPhones, at least all our family and friends in Europe do. They watch our movies, maybe not Snow White, but the rest of our movies. They speak English, and those who manage to achieve it send their kids to our country for summer school and to college. American innovation, products, and our financial system drive much of the world. And yes, we here like our foreign products as well, from Asian soy sauce and electronics to German cars and a glass of French champagne to celebrate special occasions. So when you put it in this context, it seems that all sides have potentially a lot to lose from a long and destructive trade war. To bring it back to our we personally think this is likely scenario, I expect that we'll see a bit of back and forth and a fair bit of drama over the next few days and maybe weeks or even months, but that in the end, everyone may hopefully be able to agree on a compromise that we all can live with, some more, some less. And a part of this compromise might well be that both domestic and foreign companies may build out their manufacturing base in the U.S. again, as many have already announced that they would do. And yes, this may also mean that some products might get a bit more expensive for us consumers here in the U.S. But even that's happened before. When Japanese car companies brought some of their production onshore to the U.S. starting in the 1980s to avoid an all-out trade war. Now, I have no crystal ball, as our Diamond Nest Egg regulars know, and the future looks particularly hard to predict after a week like this past one. That said, and while I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with the current administration's back and forth on tariffs, or that I appreciate the massive drop in our nest egg over the past several days, I do think that President Trump has conviction on tariffs, whether we like it or not, and he may push some level of higher tariffs through in order to try to fulfill his promises of bringing manufacturing and jobs back to the U.S., as he promised on his campaign trail. In any case, it seems that we're in for a few nail-biting days or weeks or even months in this high-stakes game of tariffs. What do you think? Which scenario is most likely in your mind? And if the price of the imported goods that you buy go up, how likely are you to switch to made in America products that may be cheaper? Drop a comment below and let us know. And let's move on now to the next section of today's video. What's everyone doing with their money right now? So the good news for Diamond NestEgg savers, at least in my mind, is that despite the past two fairly bad market days, it seems that many of you on our channel are level-headed savers. Based on this end-of-day community post yesterday, asking, how's everyone doing today? More than a third of you replied, great, it's Friday and the weekend is near. And quite a few of you left comments about picking up more bonds and stocks on the cheap. Of course, the market did shake others of you, and that's totally understandable. So, if this is you, be sure to refer back to this last video here that we did on how to prepare for a market crash. The answer may or may not surprise you when you look at the 4 worst bear market periods that we've had over the past century. As I always say, try to keep a cool head, don't panic, and don't change your fundamental strategy unless you have a strong conviction to do so. And I'll close this video with a final remark. Even though you may not always feel like doing it, stay informed of what's going on and keep following this channel. We'll make sure to keep you updated with the facts on what's happening over the coming days, weeks, and months. In addition to this special video on tariffs and trade, we'll be posting our regular weekend bond update video and some other ones shortly. We'll be sharing with you some fixed income opportunities that some of you may find interesting. So make sure you tune into those. All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And as always, if you want to learn more about bond investing, then check out this video here on our bond courses. Bond Beginners Course, folks, remember that our live online course session is this weekend on Sunday, April 6th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll be diving deeper into the 3, 10, and 30-year Treasury auctions and everything else that's happening right now. I've also linked all the details on our bond courses and YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. And see you again very soon with more brand new wealth-building content for your financial journey.